And welcome to another episode of Tony T's Toon Talk here at the Port Washington Public Library's YouTube channel. I'm Tony Traguardo, and as always, it's time to talk music. And this time around, talking music via books, and via one specific book. I am joined by a friend and an author named Ken Womack, and on this, it's being recorded on the month of what would have been John Lennon's 80th birthday. We're going to talk a bit about Ken's new book. And welcome, Ken. Thanks for coming in.
Oh, thanks so much, Tony.
So, Ken, the book is about a very specific time, and it focuses heavily on a very specific place or a specific area, meaning New York. And if you can, let everyone know the name of the book. And my first question really is, you know, with all the books that have been written about the Beatles, about John Lennon, first, how did you come to become a Beatles author? You know, after being probably, I would imagine, a longtime Beatles appreciator. And how did this become the topic of focus, and why did this become the topic of focus for you?
Well, I'm happy to note that I was a Beatles appreciator before John Lennon was wrenched out of the world, 40 years ago. So I did have a period where, my Beatles were intact. And I think we all think about that who are involved in this world of Beatlehood. As far as how I came to be interested in them, my father and mother were always really supportive of anything that I was interested in. And one day in 1977, it became the Beatles. And so really within a day or so of me watching those terrible cartoons with my Cheerios one morning, actually it was my King vitamin, to be more specific and accurate, which I know you demand with your profession. I fell in love with their music very quickly, not the cartoons so much, but, and they went to my hometown library, the Houston Public Library, and they came home with the raft of Beatles books that were available at the time, right?
Wow.
He had a couple of books by folks like Wally Podrazek and Harry Castleman, and then I guess there was a couple of illustrated lyrics, and then finally you had Wilfred Miller's Twilight of the Gods. And at 11, I was not ready for that. But on my own, I did pick up Nicholas Schaffner's The Beatles Forever, which so many of us love.
Yeah.
And the reason why I say all of this is because my interest in them was almost immediately scholarly, even though I was so young.
I can relate.
Right. And so my interest has never really been as a collector or anything of the sort. It's always been about this movement, this art movement, which is how I look at the Beatles. It's how I teach them here at Monmouth University. They are an art object. They're one that is frozen in time by their own doing, by the way. By walking off the stage forever in August 1969, they really concretized themselves. And I am enduringly interested in how they go from the relative primitiveness of Love Me Do and end up at Abbey Road in barely 7 years, which is just a remarkable accomplishment.
Absolutely.
In fact, it isn't even 7 years, when you think about when they really start working in earnest with their producer, George Martin. So that's how I come by them. And I suppose I'll keep writing about them until I feel like I finally solved this question. But it's such a tough one, right? Because it defies logic that these four guys, I guess relatively fairly well educated, right, from public school. But certainly they're no doctoral students.
Right.
How do they create this art object that will last for as long as there's such a thing as time,
and be studied in doctoral programs? That's right. The amazing part.
Programs. That's right. That's exactly right. So, as far as this new book, it's called John Lennon 1980: The Last Days in the Life, and I thought the world, and I still do, needed a book that looked at how this guy pulled himself off the deck for a variety of reasons, had gone into a kind of retirement, as he described it, I mean, at times he compared himself to Howard Hughes. He had gone into this retirement for 4 years or so, and how he pulls himself out of it at age 40 or thereabouts. And not only does he do that, but he ends on the top of his game, and even though he doesn't know the end of the story that we've all become far too used to in 40 years, it's really a remarkable accomplishment. And I wanted a book that talked about how he lived and not how he died. I wanted a book that celebrated the creative process and a person finding themselves again at a relatively later age. I mean, 40 doesn't seem very old to us now, but it seemed very different back in 1980. And I think that's a story a lot of people can benefit from. But too often, as you know, the John Lennon story is derailed by the true crime aspects. And what I find almost universally with the films and the television programs and the books that do that is they miss the mark on the reason we're all here and still here, and it's the music.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, okay, talking about the music, the book is called 1980, but you having read the book, that's a song lyric. Anyway, having read the book, you don't begin in 1980. You go back a bit, or quite a bit earlier, because John had stopped making music for all intents and purposes after his album Walls and Bridges. And so many of us out there sort of think of the John Lennon that he put forward, that he was a house husband and baking bread, and that was what he was up to. At some point, though, it seems that a switch flipped. And so could you go into a little bit of that, of how that really happened and where the book starts? In other words, what's the start? And also, too, how you very much covered the dwelling, where this all took place, which is fascinating unto itself, too. So
you bet. So what I find inevitably, particularly with this story, and this is true, I think, universally, right? When you're trying to tell a story, even though there's a certain popular knowledge base about John Lennon and the Beatles, you end up having to retell some parts of it.
Mm-hmm.
People might know John Lennon, but in this case, maybe they don't know Yoko Ono as well. So I had to do a little bit of telling of where she came from and how she gets into this story. And the next thing you know, you are having to do some flashbacks and that sort of work. And as you said, in this case, to understand what happens in 1980, you really need to understand what happens at least between 74 and 79.
Yes.
And so I had to go back and show how, no, he wasn't, in fact, always house husbanding. He was often making music when he wasn't tending to, an infant. And so you have to start tracing the story of that music so that by the time you get to 1980, you can demonstrate which songs are already in process, which ones are completely new out of whole cloth, that sort of thing. Because with any writer, and we could be talking about Virginia Woolf, right? With any writer, you need to understand what they're doing in the context and the larger breadth of their career.
Sure.
So I felt that was very necessary. I was hoping to avoid it in my original plan, but I don't think you can do that. Also important to understanding his story, though, and you said it very well, was the other character of the Dakota. And the Dakota, of course, resided and still resides in New York City. And to tell this story, to understand how different that time is, even for us now, and even though we can remember that time, 1980 was a very different place in terms of the culture of the city, the way that people tended to live in more proximal ways, living in their neighborhoods.
Yeah.
John Lennon wouldn't necessarily march to the river from the Dakota to go buy something, right? He had his local pharmacy, his local bodega. The guy who cut his hair was on his street, and that was very much how people lived in the boroughs, and not just in the boroughs, but in the neighborhoods back in those days. We simply didn't, take advantage of transportation in the same way that we do today, and how we commute and live out our daily lives. I mean, one key difference, right? If you want to think about it socioculturally, is in 1980, families ate out 1.1 times a week.
Wow.
And not everybody had a microwave. So people were making lots of home cooked meals, right? And or eating TV dinners or what have you. And by the end of the century, it's more like 5+ days a week. Some meal is being eaten out. It's probably more now, even in
Probably.
Yeah. So I wanted to make sure that people could understand just how different that time was, because then a lot of other things start to make sense.
Yeah, yeah. And one thing that I find about the book, and I think that everyone watching who will hopefully go out and read the book, is that there's a growth, other than the musical side of John. I feel that there's sort of a growth process that you end up being able to explore about this guy who we have known for so long. We've made into something of an icon in a way. But, can you tell me, during the writing process, did you find and feel that you were talking about a person who was growing, ever growing? And where did you sort of find the evidence of that most in what you were exploring when you wrote?
Absolutely. And, when you think about John Lennon, 18 of his 40 years, barely 40 years, right?
Yeah.
18 of those years were in public life. And that's unusual in a sense. So, like the other Beatles, he became a celebrity of a certain extreme renown at an early age. So we know a lot about him. And perhaps in contrast, or at least in a greater sense than the other band members, he told us more about himself. So we're able to trace these kinds of formative changes as they happen. And because we got that last spate of interviews that he and Yoko Ono, his wife, conducted in the service of selling their new album, we have a lot of information. And you're absolutely right. It's very possible to glean these very subtle but important changes in him, the things that are important to him. He's owning things in a really powerful way. There's wisdom, and of course there should be. Wisdom does come with age, even though he didn't get his fair share of that. There's a lot of wisdom you can see in the way he's thinking about things he did in the past. His friends, the other Beatles, when he has chances to reflect on those issues, and they happen a lot, there he is. My favorite anecdote is very late in his story. The album's not selling very briskly. Although it would be, I think it would debut it debuted in the 20s, but it would be number 8 the week of his murder, before that terrible news was out. It wasn't selling very quickly, and Yoko was there to talk to him about this. And she's worried. She knows how important it is for him to have this successful comeback. He's planning a reunion trip to England for the first time in 9 years. And he's like, it's okay. We still have the family.
There you go.
It's just wonderful because, I think by his own admission, he would have said that 6 years earlier, he would have, lost it for a while.
Right.
What's going wrong?
Right.
But instead, he has this incredible moment just of lucidity. And you can see it, too, in their behavior. Like all marriages, they had their ups and downs, and theirs were very public. But they were such wonderful cheerleaders for each other, especially during those last months, that it just is very heartwarming. But it's what you hope to see, in a marriage that's 12 years old at this point.
Ken Womack's new book, John Lennon, 1980, provides some fascinating insight into the few years before the release of John Lennon and Yoko Ono's album, Double Fantasy, the last album to be released during John's lifetime. Hope you've enjoyed this episode of Tony T's Toon Talk. Tony Traguardo for the Port Washington Public Library's YouTube channel. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you soon.